welcome to another episode of Pop Matters. I'm your host, Professor Lincoln Geraghty, and each month we'll be looking at pop culture matters and if they matter, from comics to sci-fi to all things fan-based. This month I have joining me Matt Weaver, PhD student in the School of Film, Media and Communication, Professor Deborah Shaw, Professor of Film and Screen Studies, and Dr. Yael Friedman, Academic Lead for Media and Screen Studies. In this episode, we'll be discussing gender and sexuality on screen. As usual with Pop Matters, we always like to start with talking about what's been happening in the last few weeks within pop culture. It does connect with what we're going to talk about today. Netflix losing subscribers. Around about 2 million people have sort of ditched their subscription, both here and the US. Why do you think that is, Deborah?
I really think it's got to do with two things. One is the cost of living crisis. People just are tightening their belts. Things are getting so expensive. People are struggling. And so that's one expense that people can save some money on. And I also think it's about the diversity of streaming platforms. So, you know, now we have Netflix, we have the iPlayer, we have Disney Plus, Now TV, and I think it's just that people can't afford all of the streaming platforms. And then there's probably a third issue, which is the kind of informal economy where people are sharing passwords and
Yes, have you shared your password?
Well, that's not something I'm prepared to disclose.
But Netflix are trying to sort of stop that, aren't they? And come up with strategies. But so in terms of content, do you think streaming providers, Matt, are offering diverse content to attract people, or is it because they're not that they're losing subscribers?
I think Netflix is really good at diverse content actually, but they don't necessarily promote the diverse content to their audiences as
Interesting,
well. I mean, I go on there and I see things that are really hidden in like the depths of Netflix that you have to search to find, or you see about on Twitter that you want to go and seek it out for yourself. But yeah, I think a lot of their content now, especially their original films, aren't the quality that they used to be, and I think there's definitely a lack of quality now. I mean, their hit series like Bridgerton, for example, that's really popular and that's watched by a lot of people, but for example, I mean, there's new films like The Bubble, for example, is one that I can think of that was released a couple of weeks ago that get really bad reviews, and I've watched them and they're not very good. So I think they rely on creating more rather than creating things with good quality as well. I think that might be why it's losing, why people are losing interest as well.
And Bridgerton season 2, have you watched that yet?
I'm halfway through it.
Any good? I've not started it yet.
Not as good as the first season, I would say.
Why do you think that is? Lack of buttocks?
Possibly, I mean, that all came later in the first season anyway,
That's true.
didn't it, really?
We had to
so
wait
maybe
for that.
it's to come. But at the moment, it's just it's a bit boring, a bit tedious. It's not really. I mean, I watch it with my mum. My mum loves it, so she still likes it.
She's a Netflix fan still.
Yeah.
Are you a subscriber to multiple platforms?
Yes.
Have you ditched or dropped any of them as part of this sort of current sort of?
Not really. No, I did with duplication with the BFI. I tend to watch Amazon Prime less than I did before, and because that sort of have less. I don't think Netflix actually has less content. I think that its algorithm is not great in terms of what it's giving. So as you say, there's these hidden gems there sometimes, and I think it's kind of all and everything, and it's kind of lacking a bit in identity. And I think the competition's catching up, and they're better at sort of giving some sort of identity to that platform. You know what you will get on Disney. Even Apple's sort of developing something
a brand identity.
And Netflix is everything.
There was a push a while back to really work with top directors such as Roma, The Irishman,
but they're still doing
and produce high quality.
To the Oscar now. That's the thing. They're still doing it. They're still bringing out some
possibly
really good...
less than they were. I think they're going for safer bets now.
So, for example, they've teamed up recently with the one of the Arab film funds, one of the only Arab film funds in Lebanon that exists. And they're curating a whole new series, they're commissioning a whole new series of films from the Arab countries, which is a real, this is something that film festivals would have done before, that film funds would have done. So they're doing also this sort of aspirational quality cinema, diversifying their content. I don't think they've necessarily done less of that. I think it's not as visible to an extent. And I think possibly they're the MENA area, for example, area of their subscription is growing.
Yeah.
So that what they lost is in sort of their mainstream in the UK, in the US, and I think that's also interesting to think where are they losing their
so they're gaining in some
customers and what.
territories.
Yeah. And now you were going to actually talk about a show that has been quite popular on Netflix.
Yes.
Yael. Tell us a bit more. Is it Heartstoppers?
Yes, it just came out now, and it's a real. I mean, again, it's directed at it's a teen LGBTQ drama, basically, and it's an adaptation of Alison Usman's web comic and comic books, which are really, really popular with teens, and so it's a Gen Z series completely in terms of that, and it speaks to me because I've got a Gen Z teen at home who's dealing with issues of gender identity and sexuality, and it was really, really popular. And I think that we've seen together that sort of BBC review, which was, the headline was pushing the envelope, and to an extent I think it's true in terms of its realistic representation. So it's set in a British school. At the heart of the plot there's a sort of a love affair between a gay couple, and they do that in the open at some point, and it's so all these issues of bullying and visibility and being accepted and not accepted are there, but they're there not as it's not a sad story. That's what I loved about it. It's also a story of affirmation.
Yeah.
And there's a trans character who moves from the boys' school to the girls' school.
Great.
And all her friends are there, and very significantly for that generation and for the sort of target audience of that, it's played by a trans actor who, some of this generation know from TikTok. She's documented her transition as well on TikTok. So there's all that.
So representation matters, doesn't it?
It does,
Netflix is clearly sort of seeking out an audience, and I know Matt and Deborah, you were going to talk about what's been happening in Florida about representation and education. What's happening with Disney and its conflict with Florida, Matt?
Yeah, so Florida have just introduced a new bill, which is activists are calling it the Don't Say Gay bill.
Yeah.
I think the official name is the Parental Rights Bill or something like that. But it's very similar to what we had in the UK for many years, which was Section 28, and it prohibits discussions and promotions of homosexuality, gender identities in schools. So it's a massive step backward. I mean, it was only repealed in the UK in 2003, which, I mean, the thought of it happening in 2022 is really bad. So, and Disney's role in it. So I did actually just research and wrote a blog on it about their involvement with it, because they're coming under quite a lot of backlash because they are such a huge corporation with so much power in Florida, and they have the opportunity to do what's right, and they didn't originally, which caused a massive staff walkout and loads of backlash against them. And what's happening now is
because they were funding Ron DeSantis, and so that a lot of the fans and subscribers and staff were very upset about that.
Yes, they didn't specifically fund the bill, but they were funding politicians and lawmakers and everything like that. So now what's sort of happening, they've condemned it now, and they've pledged to donate money to LGBTQ plus charities, which is amazing. And it's sort of resulted in this sort of war between Florida and Disney, because Florida are trying to sign a new bill that would disintegrate their local government, Disney's own government.
A political standoff, isn't it? And you'd think Disney actually might win this, because they win everything, don't they? But Ron DeSantis, you mentioned, is not just about Don't Say Gay, it's also about representations of trans.
Yeah, and I think that there's been an attack on trans. It's all part of the same package, which is kind of to also mount a kind of culture war, or put trans people at the centre of a culture war, and to try and ensure that they don't have access to, that they're unable to social transition or physical transitioning, and this sense that parents that support that are somehow child abusers. So that's obviously really inflamed the debate. And then I've been struck by the fact that at the same time you've got more and more progressive representations that Yael was talking about, shows like Heartstoppers, but also in the US with shows like Pose and Disclosure, for example, Euphoria. So you've got this really interesting moment in cultural history, in pop history, with progressive representations, and then this huge kind of campaign of attack against trans people. I noticed that Talk TV is just, they've just had the Piers Morgan show, and he's decided that trans people are fair game for attack. I feel it very personally, because we have trans students, we have trans friends, we want to be trans allies, and they're being placed centre of this attack on them, often without them being at all involved in the discussions.
Yeah, and it's through TV and media representations, as we'll talk about in a second, that we see some of the sort of attempts to correct those imbalances and those injustices. And clearly these news stories and what Netflix are trying to do with their new shows are showing there's
but then
there's
hope.
There's
hope, but then it fans the flames. With every step forward, there's a backlash, and so it's a moment of, they call them culture wars.
War. I think we are in a moment of culture wars in some ways. I think it's also a generational war to an extent.
I think that's very true. The generational. Very different attitudes with young people and older people.
We're going to get to talk about some of those specific series you mentioned in some detail, so thanks for that. It really does show you that pop culture is in the news all of the time.
Exactly.
And that takes us nicely, as I said, onto our main topic of conversation, representations of gender and sexuality on screen. Now, Matt, I know, PhD student, this is clearly a very important topic for you because you're studying it and researching it yourself. Tell us a little bit about your project. It's about representation of gay men on the film screen.
Yeah, so I'm looking at representation of gay men and HIV/AIDS and the AIDS crisis and how it's represented in film and television. So it really was sort of the popularity and how good It's a Sin was that made me want to research this.
Right.
It's a great series on Channel 4 about a group of gay men and their straight friend who negotiate the AIDS crisis in London in the 80s. So it was really popular and it was majorly impactful as well on audiences. I just knew, I looked at it and I thought, this is what I want to research. So here I am. I think it's really important because there's this massive rise in queer stories, queer content, original queer stories and queer content, but there is also this rise and this trend in depicting queer history and elements of queer history that are deemed really important, and I think that's important. Like biopics like Bohemian Rhapsody and Milk, you've got films like Pride and Stonewall, and obviously It's a Sin and things like Pose, which has AIDS as their main plot lines. So, and I guess the argument that I'm sort of looking at is why now? Why is this so popular with filmmakers now? And I think it comes back to the fact that we're sort of rewriting what has been said before or depicted before. I mean, there's films about AIDS like Philadelphia with Tom Hanks that came out sort of just after the AIDS crisis, arguably when it was still happening, and that sort of depicts Tom Hanks's character as sort of isolated from wider society. It's purely for us to feel sorry for him. And I think things like It's a Sin and Pose, they're showing gay men with AIDS in a much more celebratory way, in a much more sort of with community around them, with their friends and everything. And I think that's really important. And another thing is sort of representations of sex. I mean, sex is a really big part of AIDS. I mean, it's how it was spread, and one of the ways it spread. So that was missing from previous depictions because people were really reluctant to portray it on screen. And now you have programs like It's a Sin, where they had intimacy coordinators on set to really grasp these really explicit sex scenes. And I remember watching it and thinking, wow, this is incredible that this is being shown. It's majorly impactful. And I think that's why it's happening now.
Russell T Davies, isn't it? It's a Sin. Do you think that's an important, being a sort of a gay man sort of telling that story?
It's funny, we were just talking about this and we, Russell T Davies is the key creator behind Queer as Folk.
Absolutely.
Which was really groundbreaking because it was very, again, celebratory, sexually explicit, very queer in this refusal to ask for apology in representation. but there was almost no mention of AIDS. So it's almost like the times have come together. A certain amount of time had to pass. And I think it is important that you have people that were part of the community telling their own stories, but almost when they were ready to tell their own stories. I think a certain amount of time had to pass. And then the platforms had to be there to allow people to tell their stories. We were talking about, Matt can tell us more, but that Russell T Davies really struggled to find someone who would take It's a Sin.
Really? With Netflix and Amazon Prime even?
Yeah, well, they were pitching it to the BBC and ITV. I actually went to a Q&A in London with the cast and crew of It's a Sin on Monday, just gone, and someone asked them about that and why it was rejected by BBC and ITV, and they didn't really give away too much information, but the general consensus is that it's just not right for them. And obviously Channel 4 had the history of Queer as Folk and everything, and obviously there's this whole debate about it being privatised now, and I don't think programmes like that would be on there.
That's the next challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, so it was on the right platform, but I think that's why they believe, they didn't say much about it, and they haven't in the media either, so I guess it's a guessing game.
But maybe there's still a certain degree of squeamishness about representing sexuality.
I think that's what it is.
That Channel 4 was the right kind of platform for that story to be told.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Also in terms of the explicitity of it, not just gay sex, any sex. Channel 4 was,
and is. And the response was phenomenal, wasn't it? Of It's a Sin.
Yes. It's been nominated for so many BAFTAs. I think it was like the leading show at the BAFTAs. It was named number 1 in the Guardian's list of TV shows in 2021. But it's also had a massive impact away from that as well. There's been a rise in HIV testing as a result, so many more people are getting tested. So it's all that together. And I think it was All 4's most watched new series to date on the streaming service.
That's how I watched it through the streaming service.
I think it's on BritBox. Now it's on Netflix as well. So,
is it? Okay.
Yeah, as of this
Another
week.
Netflix original, is it?
They'll probably try and pass it as such. But it's so the fact they put that, and it was on HBO Max in America, I believe. So it's got this massive audience. And I know loads of people that have watched it that said they were educated as a result of it as well, and in a way it educated me, like as a gay man and in the contemporary era that doesn't really know much about that and is now researching it full time. It's
and there was a lot on the web then after that, partly from Channel 4. I remember I watched it live when it was on, and they had all this additional information about the historical information about it, which was really, as you say, educational. It was very.
And I think this is Pop Matters, popular culture, but it's popular culture telling people their histories and that aren't addressed in the school curriculum or social.
Certainly wouldn't be for Ron DeSantis,
other forms of media. Exactly.
He wouldn't like this being talked about.
And they weren't on mainstream television. Let's not forget they might have been featured in independent cinema for a few decades before, but not on mainstream television.
And it's important. Safe sex is still important for young people. So it does, as Matt said, it just serves a really important social function as well as an entertainment function.
And the platform's interesting because there was a promise of cable networks, satellite TV, because they weren't so much constrained by broadcast rules about what they could show at particular times, that they were seen as some of the vanguard of showing, as you said, more extreme relationships, sexuality, representations. And I want to turn to Sense8 because that has been praised in its sort of representations from adult themes. And we have an author of an edited collection, Sense8, edited by Deborah Shaw, and I wanted to ask you what it takes to edit a book like this on such a topic, on such a popular and what you might say cult series.
This was co-edited by myself and Rob Stone, so I want to give my co-editor credit. And I think you often start a bit like Matt, really. A lot of academic work starts from a position of love or hate. And this was definitely fandom that myself and a few really well-known academics were clearly fans of the series, and we thought that there was something to be said here about tying it with the development of Netflix. So we've got chapters in the book on the first chapter, what's going on Netflix and the commissioning of Sense8. So we kind of used it to interrogate the platform, but also in terms of diverse sexualities, the fact that it was co-created by the Wachowskis. At the time, Lana had transitioned. Now they've both transitioned. So, these really influential creators of The Matrix being on board with this series was very interesting in itself.
So is the sci-fi element important? The sort of, the connections between those characters?
I think that's a really good question, because the sci-fi element allows for a kind of utopian vision of society.
Right. Yeah.
So you have these 8 characters from different parts of the world who connect. They're a different species, hence the sci-fi series. They're Homo sensorium.
Okay.
So they have this kind of sensate,
right.
sensorium. And these are characters that have, their superpower is effectively empathy. So because I can connect with Yael, because we're sensates, hypothetically.
Excellent. Revealed here today.
Because I can...
we sometimes feel like that.
Yael didn't get a great night's sleep last night, and so I'm feeling tired. And so I can give her my energy because I had a really good night's sleep. That's kind of fascinating.
Gotcha.
So you have characters that are fantastic fighters that can match up with people who are very good actors, and they share their skills to defeat the enemy. And of course the enemy, which is called Biological Preservation Organisation, which has a kind of eugenics tone to it, biological, trying to enforce uniformity, giving lobotomies to these sensates.
Wow.
So it's almost like their enemy is people that insist on the binary, gender uniformity, conformity, trying to erase them. So it uses, to get back to your question, the sci-fi premise to present this utopian world where we're all united. We're all, well, those of us who buy into that, we kind of connected, we help each other. Ethnicity, nationality, all of these things are kind of transcended. So it kind of creates this beautiful utopian society where we can all be one family. And the idea of the chosen family, which is a very queer idea, is really celebrated in Sense8.
Yeah, and what struck me about the show is that it is that sort of transnational book plug, transnational, geographic, sort of connecting all parts of. You mentioned the sort of importance of series on Netflix that speak to a sort of Middle Eastern or sort of Asian audience. Is that important?
One other point, I don't want to dominate, but one other point about Sense8 is the idea that the characters visit each other.
Right.
So they can appear in another country, appear in another room. And in effect, it's a metaphor of the internet and digital platforms, because suddenly these people are in your living rooms. You know, it's like Skype or Zoom. So Sense8 really was very much like the Matrix, ahead of its time, because it was kind of pre-pandemic, but showing how we can be there in each other's lives, we can visit each other. Well, so that's another really interesting aspect of the series.
So cutting the sort of physical distance between us and our neighbours,
It's that global utopia that when it doesn't matter that much where they are. I mean, we often talk about it, Deborah and I, with the students. It's, I think there's a difference between, they do draw on stereotype in representing all these places, partly because you have to, I suppose. These are shortcuts. It sometimes is a shorthand,
so
and you have to.
And things like
a bit.
It's more that the African characters in a shanty town, the Korean character is very high tech, and she's very good at martial arts. So in that sense,
and the landscape that the Icelandic is the whole. So it's drawing on that, but the heart of it is that connection, which I think is what was really intriguing about that utopia. That it's and the intersection, I suppose, of the plurality across different elements of our identity.
Yeah,
exactly.
It was, it wasn't only trans people there, it wasn't only gay, there was a plurality between them of the cultural backgrounds, the gender, the sexual identity, and all that intersected in some way, which to an extent, I think those intersections are kind of where it touched the zeitgeist a bit.
Yeah. So, and then the fandom, I don't know if you want to say anything about the fandom of the series.
There was a huge uproar when the show was cancelled, and why do you think that was? Why do you think it was cancelled? Because it was great, and I don't think it should have been.
It's very interesting. It was the most expensive series ever made on television. So each episode was $9 million approximately. And it had a huge fan base around the world, but also quite a niche fan base. So even though it had kind of action-adventure popular content, it was quite queer. So, you had all the fans all over the world connecting, sharing birthdays, creating fora, which was really fascinating. But Netflix said it just came down to the money. They couldn't continue to support such an expensive project. I mean, they literally would fly to each location. So if you think about 8 locations, they would fly to those locations, have film crews in each location. Very, very expensive to make. But they stopped it after season 2 on a cliffhanger with one of the beloved characters, about to die. So the fans went absolutely crazy.
And it's forever frozen at that moment.
Well, it's not.
Not forever.
Because the fans went mad. Loads of campaigns to Netflix, writing letters, relentless. Netflix kept saying no, 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 no. Then Lana Wachowski appears and says, it's amazing, they've given me a finale.
Okay.
So there was a season finale.
Great.
Which, of course, the hardcore fans...
Yeah, well, absolutely.
It didn't satisfy the hardcore fans because initially it was slated for 5 series.
Yeah.
But we got to see what happened. And there was a wish fulfillment, utopian ending.
Yeah.
Well, often fandom is often equated to sort of religion and the sort of importance of having something to sort of really believe in and trust. And I know, you want to talk...
That's my chapter in the book.
There you go.
About how it's a new religion.
It's a new religion.
Yeah.
And a series like Transparent, which dealt with sort of both religion and sort of trans issues. You wanted to talk a little bit about how important that was as a series in terms of representation.
Well, I think it was, it was pretty much groundbreaking in terms of putting this character and the plot line of a transitioning, a man to woman on mainstream TV. So at the time when it came out in 2014, and it's an Amazon series, you didn't see that on mainstream TV. So that alone, it's got a lot of flaws, but that alone was really interesting and important in that respect, in being trans-affirmative in that way. But it's the way in which his character is built as well, and how it's that intersection with religion, as you say. It's not so much religion in that period, it's almost an ethnicity as well, and it's that kind of idea of Jewishness and what it is. But I think the one really important thing is that main character, that it's a Jewish family in affluent, white, extremely white, we don't see anything but white, Los Angeles at the time, who the patriarch of the family, the father, is going through a transformation into the matriarch of the family. And all of this, I think the fact that and he's a professor, emerite professor in university, I think it's literature, I can't remember actually. But English Lit. But the important thing, this is a mainstream character. She's a mainstream character. She's a mainstream character. They are mainstream character. It's a mainstream. So it's taking that story of the transgender away from the margin and plunking it at the heart of affluent American society. And then it's Jewish as well. So the whole sort of, all these questions of identity are explored on various intersectional levels. So it's as much as it's a series about transitioning to, about transgender identity, it's a series about queer identities and about the exploration of queer identities. It's a series about Jewishness, about family, about Jewish, and I think he did 2 very important things on the representation of the sort of Jewishness in that respect. He moved away from some of the really stereotypical images or what we see on Hollywood of the caring Jews. I mean, these are a family of, at least the kids, but later on they're as selfish as hell. There's nothing like, we tend to see the sort of Jewish therapist, sort of caring, thinking, sort of, they've got empathy just for their own self-obsession.
More Curb Your Enthusiasm then.
More than that. They're irritatingly annoying and selfish, these sort of characters.
But we care about them as well.
Yes, I think we care. I cared more about the people they hurt along the line. But it is, and it was very brave. I think it was very brave to sort of do that. And then their process of transitioning, if you like, or the sort of gender questions and experiments with identity are rooted in their Jewishness. You see what I mean? So I think that was really interesting. It was more multidimensional than what you tend to see. It wasn't, the identity of the characters doesn't come down to one thing. It's not just about that.
It's a very interesting text, and I don't think we should forget it in this sense of cancel culture, because it was a very interesting text. It was made by as was Jill Soloway, who's become Joey Soloway, who's identified as non-binary.
And it was about
their experience of their own father who transitioned. It had a lot of trans creators writing and as part of the team. But what they did was they cast a cis man to play Maura, the trans character. And then some of the trans people on the cast accused Jeffrey Tambor of sexually harassing them. And so, which was very sad, really, because it did a lot of very good things, which is why I don't think we should cancel the series. Rather kind of study it for its interesting points. And then they kind of wrapped it up in a final series without Jeffrey Tambor.
But it's part of this mainstream, at the moment, as you said, sort of posited or indeed showing the sort of true life of a sort of someone transitioning and how that affects their family. And trans is mainstream now. It's now part of reality TV.
But wasn't then.
Well, it wasn't then. And I think primetime television was probably not ready for a trans actor as well to sort of play. But it wasn't very, there were mixed, at least the reviews I've read about it over the years with, from the point of view of people who are trans or critics and reviewers. And there were mixed reviews about it. I mean, the fact that he was played by a cis man was an issue. Some of the representation of Myra, his character, is represented in a very, I would say, a female gaze. There's something very sort of non-judging and developing about it. But there's other characters that are quite caricatured in some ways. So that it wasn't by any means overtly sort of embraced, but as a text that was trans affirmative in doing all the representation right, if you like. There were issues
and maybe our role as critics is to say, a text can be flawed but very interesting. We don't have to go down this dichotomy of let's cancel it, it doesn't do this. It was flawed, but it was also very new, very innovative, very interesting.
And very brave, I think, in what it says. And he left, it was, the finale was so flamboyant, so ridiculous. It was a musical finale. That was, and I hated it and loved it at the same time, because it was so terrible that I loved it, that she actually
But I think, Matt, didn't you write your MA thesis? Wasn't it part of your MA thesis? What's your take on what we're saying?
I mean, it was, I think it was really progressive in that it showed a different way of showing the trans body. And it was, where it went previously from sort of, trans characters die quickly in programs before, and they can often be seen like fetishized or villainous or something like that, and that's
leaving the margins
different.
Of society. I thought that was its major
to show this white privileged man become a woman that's very inquisitive. And at one point she volunteers for like a suicide hotline and stuff, so she's working on bettering herself because she used to be misogynistic when she was a man. So it's a really interesting character arc, I reckon.
Flamboyance is, I think, ties into, as I said, how mainstream sort of trans culture has been on TV. The BBC has asked RuPaul to sort of make programming just for BBC Three. RuPaul has sort of almost come back from, their sort of renown in the 80s and 90s. And I know, Matt, you are a fan of RuPaul's Drag Race. And talking about doing work on that, I think you wrote a fan report on Drag Race fans. What do you think is the significance of that reality show in placing sort of trans issues front and centre?
I think that's it, really, is the reality of it. These are not fictional characters. They're real life people who have gone through things in their life, or are experiencing things at that time about their genders and everything like that. And I think that's really important, especially for queer youth, because it's massively popular with young people.
But there is a difference between trans and drag, isn't there? I don't know if you want to say anything about the difference.
So there's been a lot of debate about that, and RuPaul has been very controversial in some of the things he said about letting trans queens on his show. And that's seemingly changed now, because we've had lots of trans queens since then, so clearly he's worked on that. There is a fine line between that, and that's been open to lots of debate over time. It's sort of open to everyone. On the last series of the US version, they just had a straight man that does drag, and that caused a lot of backlash, because people said, well, this is a space for queer people, this is a space for trans people, and then that it's just, and it comes back to reality TV as publicity in a way, because I think that Queen was cast, could be controversial, I think that Queen was cast because of that, because it gets people talking. And that's what reality TV does so well. And I mean, it is sort of dramas amplified and everything, so that's come under a lot of backlash, but it is essentially it's a phenomenon, and it's so popular, and it's opening up gay and straight audiences, queer and straight audiences to queer culture and queer history. There's discussions of coming out stories on there, histories of abuse, queens coming out as non-binary, there's disabled queens on there, there's trans-masculine queens, so someone that used to be a woman and is now a man that does drag, so there's so much out there. And I mean, I watched the UK version of my mum. She doesn't like the US version. She likes the UK one because I think she knows people on it and everything.
UK pride then, yeah.
So she watches it and she says there's nothing else like it on TV, and it's so true. And it says it opens her up to elements of queer culture that she didn't know existed, and elements of queer history and drag queens and everything. And who knows, maybe she'll come to a drag show with me one day. But I think it's, I could talk about it all day. It's so important, and there's a lot of people just see it as a reality TV television program, but it's so much more than that. There is so much like heart to it, and it's doing so much for the community as well.
And I think what that underlines, again, as you said, Deborah, is that this is popular culture, and it shows all of these issues, and sometimes ignored or forgotten audiences, members of the society and UK nation that we live in. Is so important to have that sort of representation on screen.
And with streaming as well, I mean, Drag Race has its own streaming service now as well. So it was originally on Netflix in the UK, the US version anyway, the original one. Obviously we've got the UK one on BBC, but there's so many transnational franchises now. There's ones in Holland, Canada, Spain. There's a France one coming out soon, a Swedish one coming out soon, and they all go onto this platform called Wow Presents Plus. So it's almost created this whole new streaming. I mean, I think it's lost a lot of viewers because of that, but I mean, I subscribe to it. So
truly, trans has gone transnational.
Yeah,
and it's creating its own streaming service, which is
Well, that's brilliant. Thanks. We could talk all day, as you said, about these topics. And just a reminder that, as we have also said, you're working and researching on these topics all the time, publishing this output. And good luck on your PhD. 2 supervisors here.
Yeah.
I think you'll pass.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Definitely. Hopefully.
but not tie them into a corner just yet. But good luck with that. I'm sure you'll be fine. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for today. If you have any questions about what we've been talking about in this episode, as usual, pop them in the comments under the video. But for now, my thanks go to Matt Weaver, Professor Deborah Shaw, and Dr. Yael Friedman. We've been discussing gender and sexuality on screen because pop matters.